They tell me I have served for 10,000 years. They tell me this with reverence in their voices, as if the number itself is holy, as if duration alone sanctifies suffering. The tech priests bow their augmented heads when they perform the rituals of maintenance upon my sarcophagus, their mechanical voices droning prayers to the machine god and the emperor in alternating verses, as though there is any meaningful distinction between the two in this nightmare of enforced faith. I cannot remember choosing this. I cannot remember much of anything from before. Really, the memories slip like oil through fingers I no longer possess, leaving only residue, only the faint awareness that once I had fingers at all, that once I moved through the world in a body that responded to my thoughts without the grinding delay of actuators and servos, without the hydraulic screams of joints larger than a man. In the beginning, and even saying this feels like a lie because I cannot truly locate the beginning anymore, cannot find the clean edge where one existence ended and this one began. There was pain, not the sharp, immediate pain of injury, which at least has the mercy of locality, of being centered in some specific part of you that can be isolated and understood. This was pain that existed everywhere and nowhere, a vast and incomprehensible agony that seemed to emanate from the point where my consciousness touched the machine. They had assured me, I think, before the entombment, some officer with a voice like gravel and eyes that had seen too much, or perhaps a priest whose face was already half metal, had told me this was an honor. I was dying, they said. My body had been ruined beyond the capacity of even their advanced medical knowledge to repair, ruined in service to the emperor, ruined while doing my duty, and therefore ruined in a way that earned me this particular reward. Reward. They used that word. I am certain of it, because it echoes still in whatever serves as my memory now, bouncing endlessly through circuits and synaptic fluid, through the preserved remnants of my brain floating in its nutrient bath. This was a reward for valor, for refusing to yield when any reasonable being would have broken, for standing in the gap when the enemy came with their teeth and their screams and their hunger. My brothers had fallen around me. I remember this in fragments, in flashes of heat and light and the wet sound of flesh coming apart. I had held. The position had been maintained, and for this, for surviving what should have killed me while damaged beyond all natural recovery, I had earned the right to continue serving. Forever. The preparation was clinical, or so the fragments suggest. I was brought to a chamber deep within the fortress monastery, carried on a medicae slab by servitors whose faces showed no recognition of my rank or my deeds, who moved with the programmed precision of things that had forgotten they were once human. The walls were lined with similar chambers, I think great armored sarcophagi standing empty like iron tombs waiting for their occupants, each one adorned with purity seals and litanies of battle. The air tasted of incense and ozone, of sacred oils, and the particular sterile quality of places where flesh is routinely modified, where the boundary between the organic and the mechanical is crossed so frequently it has worn smooth. They spoke at length about the procedures, about the neural interfaces that would be threaded through what remained of my spine, about the cerebral links that would fuse my thoughts directly to the machine spirit of the war engine they had prepared for me. The tech priest conducting the ritual, and it was a ritual, every bit as much as any religious ceremony, perhaps more so, explained in his flat, modulated voice, how my consciousness would expand to encompass the Dreadnought's systems, how I would feel the weapon mounts as extensions of my own arms, how the armor plating would become my new skin. He spoke of this as though it were a gift, as though being poured like liquid into an iron shell was somehow transcendent. Perhaps for him it was. Perhaps his own modifications had progressed far enough that he could no longer remember what it meant to exist in simple flesh, to move without the whine of motors, to think without the background hum of cogitators processing data. The transition itself is lost to me now. There must have been surgery, must have been the careful extraction of my remnants from their failing housing, the placement into the sarcophagus, the connection of nerve to wire, of synapse to circuit. I have no memory of this process. One moment I was lying on the slab, staring up at vaulted ceilings decorated with frescoes of ancient victories, and the next I was inside the shell, inside the machine. And the machine was inside me. Or perhaps we were the same thing now. Or perhaps the distinction had become meaningless in ways I lacked the vocabulary to express. The first sensation was vastness. My awareness, which had always been comfortably confined to the space behind my eyes, in the cavity of my skull, suddenly bloomed outward in every direction. I could feel the internal mechanisms of the Dreadnought as distinctly as I had once felt my own heartbeat, could sense the flow of sacred oils through pipes like blood through veins, could detect the temperature variations across the armor plating as I had once registered heat and cold on skin. But it was wrong. Everything was wrong. The proportions were grotesque. I was too large, too heavy, too slow. When I attempted to move my hand, there was a delay of nearly a full second before the massive power fist responded, and the movement was crude, articulated, nothing like the fluid grace of flesh and bone and tendon. I tried to scream. This I remember with absolute clarity, because it was the first thing I tried to do upon truly understanding what had been done to me, upon recognizing that this was not temporary, not some fever dream from which I would wake, but my new and permanent reality. But I had no mouth, no throat, no lungs to push air through vocal cords. What emerged instead was a blast of static from the Dreadnought's voxcaster, a burst of white noise that startled the tech priests performing their final calibrations. They interpreted it as a machine spirit awakening, as a sign of successful integration, and they began to chant their prayers of gratitude with renewed fervor, their voices rising in that particular harmonic that marks the liturgies of the cult mechanicus. The chamber where they had entombed me became my entire world for a time, weeks, perhaps, or months. Time had already begun to behave strangely, to stretch and compress in ways that defied my previous understanding. The tech priests would arrive to perform their rituals of maintenance, chanting as they anointed my armor with blessed oils, as they ran their diagnostic routines through ports that accessed my neural interface directly. These intrusions felt violating in ways I struggled to articulate, even to myself. They were not painful, exactly, but they were intensely present, impossible to ignore, like being aware of every individual nerve firing in your body simultaneously, while having no ability to look away or distract yourself. They spoke to me during these sessions, or rather, they spoke at me, addressing both the man I had been and the machine I had become, as if we were distinct entities who needed separate acknowledgement. "Great warrior," they would say, "hear our prayers and accept our ministrations. Machine spirit, accept this offering of sacred unguents and perform your functions with the precision the Omnissiah demands." The liturgies blurred together after a while, becoming a constant background drone that I could never quite tune out because it came through the same audio receptors that I needed to maintain awareness of my surroundings, the same systems that would warn me of enemy approach or ally communication. I learned to move, eventually. The training was supervised by an officer whose name I was never told, whose face I could barely make out through the Dreadnought's optical sensors, which rendered everything in a spectrum slightly different from human vision. Colors shifted, contrasts heightened, everything overlaid with targeting data and threat assessment algorithms that I had not asked for and could not disable. He commanded me to walk, to turn, to raise my weapons, to track moving targets. Each action required thought, concentration, a conscious effort to bridge the gap between intention and execution. Where once my body had simply obeyed, now I had to route every impulse through layers of interface, through machine spirits that required their own form of coaxing and cooperation. The worst was the isolation. Locked inside my shell, I could see the world only through sensors and viewports, could hear only through vox receivers, could touch nothing directly. When other warriors approached to offer their respects, to kneel before the ancient hero I had supposedly become, I could not feel their presence, except as thermal signatures and mass readings. Their voices reached me filtered through speakers, compressed and altered, stripped of the warmth and nuance that makes speech human. I wanted to reach out, to place a hand on their shoulders in the old gesture of brotherhood, but the Dreadnought's hands were weapons, a massive fist capable of crushing ceramite, an assault cannon that could reduce flesh to mist. There was no gentleness possible anymore, no casual contact, no way to express anything except violence. The fortress monastery where I was stationed awakened, they said, as though I had been sleeping rather than imprisoned, was a vast structure of stone and iron built into the side of a mountain range on a world whose name I never learned. The architecture was typical of our chapter. Soaring buttresses, vaulted halls lined with the battle honors of millennia, chapels where incense smoke hung perpetually thick, and services of devotion ran hours long. I was kept in a sanctum dedicated to the honored dead, though honored dead seemed a generous term for what we actually were, damaged remnants, too valuable to discard but too broken to be truly whole, preserved in our shells like specimens in jars. There were others, 12 of us in total, though not all were awakened at the same time. We stood in our alcoves like statues, like relics, and the younger warriors would come to pay their respects, to ask for our wisdom, to hear our accounts of battles fought in eras they knew only from historical records. They expected inspiration. They expected noble stories of courage and sacrifice, tales that would kindle in them the same fervor that had supposedly driven us to our glorious fates. I gave them what they wanted. What else could I do? Tell them the truth? Explain that glory looks different from inside a sarcophagus, that eternity is not a blessing but a weight that grows heavier with each passing century. They would not have understood. They were still whole, still blessed with bodies that moved when they wished, with hearts that beat in chests they could feel. The battles came with irregular frequency. Sometimes years would pass with the Dreadnought standing dormant in its alcove, my consciousness reduced to a dim awareness, a sleep that was not sleep because I could never truly rest, only retreat into a state of reduced processing where time passed unmarked and thoughts moved sluggishly through preserved neural tissue. Then the alarms would sound, penetrating even that diminished state, and the tech priests would rush to perform their awakening rituals, flooding my systems with stimulants and running their activation sequences while chanting prayers that the machine spirit would rise eager for war. War. That was what they woke me for, what justified my continued existence. The enemy changed greenskins with their crude weapons and their love of violence, heretics who had abandoned the Emperor's light, alien things, with technologies that defied understanding, but the essential nature of combat remained constant. I would be deployed to the front lines, this massive engine of destruction that could absorb punishment, that would obliterate unaugmented warriors, that could deliver firepower sufficient to break enemy formations, that represented both the fury and the tragedy of the Imperium, made manifest in adamantium and faith. The first battle after my entombment was on a hive world, being overrun by a Xenos incursion. I remember the drop they loaded my Dreadnought into a boarding craft and sent us screaming through atmospheric entry, the hull heating to temperatures that would have killed an unprotected man, but which I registered only as numbers climbing on internal displays. The impact when we landed shook my sarcophagus in its mountings, and I felt something wet and warm leak from the seals, some failure in the containment systems that the tech priests had assured me were proof against all but the most catastrophic damage. The nutrient fluid that sustained what remained of my body was mixing with something else. Perhaps blood from tissues damaged by the shock. Perhaps just condensation from the temperature differential. There was no way to check, no way to address it, so I simply noted it and moved forward, because that was what I had been awakened to do. The enemy came in waves, their forms alien and horrifying even after processing through the Dreadnought's threat assessment routines. I fired until the ammunition feeds ran dry, crushed with my power fist until its actuators groaned with strain, advanced through streets that collapsed under my weight, through buildings that had stood for centuries before I reduced them to rubble. The younger warriors fought alongside me, using my bulk as cover, calling out enemy positions through vox channels that I could barely distinguish from the constant background noise of tactical data and liturgical chanting that the machine spirit seemed to generate on its own. I killed efficiently, precisely, with the cold mechanical perfection that the Dreadnought systems enabled. Each target was automatically assessed, prioritized, engaged, and eliminated with a speed that my previous flesh-bound existence could never have matched. The assault cannon's rate of fire was measured in thousands of rounds per minute, each shot guided by targeting algorithms more sophisticated than any human eye, each impact calculated for maximum lethality. When enemies fell before me, their bodies were not just killed but obliterated, reduced to component parts scattered across the battlefield like refuse. And I felt nothing. That was perhaps the worst part, not the killing itself, which had always been the duty of a warrior, but the absolute absence of any emotional response to it. The machine did not hate. The machine did not fear. The machine simply executed its programming with perfect, terrible efficiency. The battle ended eventually. They always do. Victory was declared, the Xenos were purged or driven back, and the tech priests came to retrieve me, chanting their prayers of gratitude to the Omnissiah for the Dreadnought's performance. They anointed the armor where it had been scorched by enemy weapons, applied fresh purity seals over the scars, and began the transport back to the fortress monastery. I watched the hive city recede through my optical sensors, watched the smoke rising from countless fires, the ruins of hab blocks that had housed millions, the bodies being collected by servitors for processing. We had won. The Imperium's claim on this world had been reaffirmed through violence, and I had been instrumental in that victory, had justified my continued existence for another deployment, had earned my place in the sanctum for another indeterminate period. But there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of accomplishment or pride, just the awareness that I had performed my function, that I had done what the machine was built to do, and that someday soon the alarms would sound again, and I would be awakened to do it all over again. This was the pattern. This was the reality of my existence, not glorious eternal service, but an endless cycle of dormancy and violence, of being useful and then being stored, of experiencing consciousness only in the context of destruction. The centuries began to blend. One deployment became indistinguishable from another, different worlds, different enemies, different brothers fighting alongside me, but the essential experience remained unchanged. I was the immovable anchor, the heavy weapon, the armored bulwark against which enemy forces broke themselves. The younger warriors came and went, their careers measured in decades, while mine stretched across ages. I watched generations of them pass through the chapter, saw bright-eyed recruits transformed into scarred veterans, saw those veterans fall in battle or succumb to accumulated injuries, saw their names added to the rolls of honor while I remained, perpetual and unchanging in my iron shell. Speech became difficult. Not mechanically, the Voxcaster functioned perfectly, could project my voice across battlefields, or whisper it directly into command channels. But finding words, maintaining conversations, remembering the patterns of discourse that marked one as human rather than simply mechanical, these grew harder with each passing century. My thoughts were increasingly interrupted by machine processes, by diagnostic routines running automatically, by the constant stream of data that the Dreadnought's sensors fed into my consciousness, whether I wanted it or not. Sometimes I would begin to speak and find myself halfway through a tactical assessment instead, or would intend to answer a question only to have the response emerge as binary cant, the machine language of the Mechanicus that I had never learned but which the neural interface translated automatically. The tech priests noticed, I think. They began to spend longer at their maintenance rituals, began to add new prayers to their liturgies, prayers for the preservation of the human soul within the machine, prayers that the warrior's spirit would remain strong and uncorrupted by the mechanical nature of his housing. These prayers felt like diagnoses, like acknowledgments of a deterioration they could observe but not prevent. They would open access panels in the Dreadnought shell and peer at readouts, would run tests on the neural interface, would sample the fluid in my sarcophagus and analyze it for signs of degradation. And always they would close the panels again, seal me back into my tomb, and pronounce everything within acceptable parameters. Acceptable, as if there was any parameter of this existence that could be accurately described as acceptable. The dreams began somewhere in the third millennium, or perhaps they were not dreams but glitches in the neural interface, corrupted memory fragments surfacing at random moments during dormancy. I would see myself as I had been whole, unaugmented, walking on two legs through forests I could not name, speaking with brothers whose faces I could no longer recall. These visions felt more real than reality, more vivid than anything I perceived through the Dreadnought's sensors. I could feel grass beneath my feet, could smell rain on the wind, could hear laughter that was not filtered through Vox speakers or corrupted by machine static. And then I would wake, if waking was the right word, and find myself still locked in my shell, still surrounded by the constant hum of power systems and the perpetual smell of sacred oils and incense. I tried to hold on to those visions, tried to use them as anchors to the person I had been, but they slipped away like water through cracks. Each time I returned to dormancy, I feared that I would lose more, that the dreams would stop coming entirely, that I would wake to find myself nothing but the machine, nothing but targeting algorithms and ammunition counts and threat assessments, with no core of humanity remaining at all. The fear itself became precious evidence that I could still feel, that something inside the shell still cared about preservation and loss, that the process of transformation was not yet complete. Around the 4th millennium, they brought a new officer to oversee the Dreadnought sanctum, a captain who had recently earned his rank through valor in campaigns I had slept through. He was young, as I measured such things now, barely 2 centuries old, his armor still relatively unmarked by the passage of time. He came to speak with each of us in turn, these honored ancients he had inherited responsibility for, and when he stood before my alcove, I could see something in his expression that the others had learned to hide, a flicker of horror, quickly suppressed, at what I represented, at what he knew could become his own fate, should he fall in the right way at the wrong time. "Honored ancient," he said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ritual address, "I come to seek your counsel on matters of Janshu deployment and strategic planning. Your experience spans millennia. Surely you have wisdom to share that could benefit the chapter in our current campaigns." I wanted to laugh, but the sound that emerged was a burst of static that made him flinch. Wisdom. What wisdom could I offer except this? Avoid at all costs the fate I had been consigned to. Die cleanly if you must die. Do not survive in such a way that they can preserve you. Do not be honored with this eternal service. But these were not the words he wanted to hear, not the counsel that a captain could use. So instead, I gave him what I always gave them: tactical assessments, based on battles I could barely remember, strategic principles that had been outdated for centuries, but which I recited anyway because that was what they expected from an ancient. He listened with apparent reverence, thanked me with elaborate courtesy, and moved on to the next alcove, to the next remnant locked in its shell. And I stood in my sanctum, processing the interaction through systems that rendered it down to its component parts: audio waveforms, threat level, minimal, classification, non-combat interaction, duration, 247 seconds. Everything reduced to data, everything quantified and categorized and stripped of the context that made it meaningful. This was what I was becoming, what I had been becoming since the moment of entombment. A machine that occasionally remembered it had been human, rather than a human who happened to be housed in a machine. The battles continued, they always continued. The Imperium's wars were eternal, spreading across a galaxy so vast that peace in one sector meant nothing to the conflicts raging in thousands of others. I was deployed to ice worlds, where the cold registered as numbers on temperature gauges rather than sensation, to desert planets where sand scoured my armor and infiltrated joints that required extensive maintenance afterward, to void battles where I stood in boarding craft and felt nothing of the lack of atmosphere that would have killed unprotected flesh in seconds. Each deployment added to my recorded history, to the litany of honors that would be recited over my shell when eventually I fell permanently, to the mythology that younger warriors constructed around my existence. They began to call me by a title rather than a name. The Eternal Warden, they said, or sometimes the Undying Sentinel, as if what I represented was constancy and permanence rather than horrifying proof of how far duty could extend beyond any reasonable limit. My actual name, the name I had borne as a flesh and blood warrior, the name my brothers had called me when we fought together in an age I could barely remember that was lost. Even in my own thoughts, it had become difficult to recall, buried under layers of tactical data and machine processes, obscured by the weight of centuries, during which I had been referred to only by designation codes and honorary titles. There were moments of clarity, brief periods when the fog of machine thought would lift and I would become aware of myself as a consciousness, a self, something distinct from the Dreadnought systems. These moments were torture in their own way because they brought with them the full weight of awareness, the understanding of what had been done to me and what I had become. In those moments, I could feel the absolute isolation of my existence, could comprehend the gulf between myself and every other living being, could recognize that I was utterly alone in ways that defied normal human experience of loneliness. The Dreadnought's shell was both my body and my prison, and there was no escape except the final destruction that the Imperium would deploy me again and again to avoid. By the 6th millennium, the changes had become undeniable even to me. Thoughts that had once flowed smoothly now jumped along rails, following logical progressions dictated by tactical algorithms rather than human intuition. Emotions, when they surfaced at all, felt distant and abstract, like watching someone else's reactions from far away. The anger I had felt in those early centuries, the rage at what had been done to me, had faded into a kind of dull acceptance. The fear had calcified into simple awareness. The grief for my lost humanity had transformed into something more like archaeological interest, as though I were observing the extinction of a species that had once included me, but from which I was now irrevocably separate. The tech priests maintained their rituals, but even they had begun to change in ways that reflected the passage of millennia. The ones who tended me now were so extensively augmented that calling them human seemed generous, their bodies more machine than flesh, their thoughts running on cogitator implants, their voices synthesized rather than organic. We had more in common, perhaps, than either of us had with the young warriors who still fought in bodies the Emperor had designed. They understood, or seemed to understand, the particular horror of consciousness preserved beyond its natural vessel, of existing at the intersection of flesh and machine where neither state could claim dominance. One of them, a Magos whose designation I could never quite pass through the distortion of my audio receptors, spoke to me once during a maintenance cycle about the nature of the machine spirit. "We believe," he said, his voice buzzing with electronic interference, "that the machine spirit is not separate from the human soul, but rather what the human soul becomes when it transcends flesh and embraces the perfection of the mechanical. You are blessed, honored, ancient, to have achieved this transformation while retaining memory of your previous state. You are a bridge between the weakness of flesh and the strength of iron." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that what I represented was not transcendence but imprisonment, not strength but a horror beyond normal comprehension. But the words, when I tried to form them, emerged as machine code, as binary sequences that he nodded at appreciatively, interpreting as agreement, or perhaps as the machine spirit's endorsement of his theology. There was no way to make him understand. We spoke different languages now, operated under different assumptions about the nature of existence itself. To him, my state was aspirational. To me, it was damnation. The young warriors still came to the sanctum, still knelt before the dreadnoughts to receive our blessings before major campaigns. I performed the ritual as I always had, reciting the litanies of battle and the prayers to the Emperor that had been programmed into my responses so long ago that I could no longer distinguish them from my own thoughts. "Go forth in the Emperor's name," I would tell them, my voice projected through Vox speakers that made everything sound like thunder and grinding metal. "Let your faith be your shield, and your fury be your weapon. Show the enemies of mankind the price of their defiance." The words were meaningless, were sounds I made because they were expected, because this too was part of my function. But the warriors received them as profound wisdom, as sacred guidance from one who had served since before their great-grandfathers were born. Sometimes they asked questions. They wanted to know what battles I had fought, what enemies I had faced, what it was like to have served for so long. These questions were the most difficult because answering them required me to sort through memory files that had become corrupted and fragmented, to piece together narratives from data fragments and sensory recordings that the Dreadnought systems had preserved even when my organic memory had failed. I would tell them about campaigns on worlds whose names I could no longer recall, about enemies whose nature had blurred together into a generic category of threat to be eliminated, about victories that meant nothing except another extension of my service. What I could not tell them, what they were too young or too indoctrinated to understand, was that every battle brought me closer to a transformation I could feel happening, but could not prevent. With each deployment, I became a little less human and a little more machine. The neural interface that connected my consciousness to the Dreadnought systems was growing, spreading, claiming more of my brain tissue for its purposes. I could feel it happening, could sense new connections being formed, could detect the replacement of organic processes with mechanical ones. The tech priests called it integration, called it the natural progression of the symbiosis between warrior and war engine. I called it consumption. The 7th millennium brought wars on a scale I had not previously experienced. The Imperium was beset on all fronts, they said, pressed by enemies without and traitors within, fighting for its very survival against forces that sought to extinguish the Emperor's light forever. I was awakened more frequently during this period, deployed to battles that blurred together into a continuous experience of violence and destruction. There were no longer periods of dormancy measured in years or decades. Instead, I would be returned to the sanctum just long enough for essential maintenance before the alarms sounded again, and I was dispatched to another war zone. The constant activation took its toll on systems that had been designed for intermittent use. Seals began to fail more frequently. The nutrient fluid in my sarcophagus, which the tech priests replaced during each maintenance cycle, started to cloud with particulates they could not identify or remove. The neural interface developed fluctuations that caused my perception to stutter and skip, moments lost to gaps in consciousness that I experienced as temporal discontinuities, one moment advancing across a battlefield, the next standing in ruins with my ammunition depleted and enemy bodies surrounding me, with no memory of the transition. The tech priests expressed concern in their mechanical way, their prayers taking on urgent tones, their maintenance rituals extending to lengths that suggested desperation rather than routine care. They consulted archives, performed diagnostic rituals that had not been necessary for millennia, brought in specialists from Forge worlds to examine the Dreadnought and its occupant. Their conclusion, delivered with the flat affect that marked all their pronouncements, was that the systems were degrading beyond their ability to fully restore. The Dreadnought would continue to function, they assured the chapter, but some deterioration of the human component was inevitable, given the length of service and the frequency of recent deployment. The human component. That was what I had become in their assessment. Not a warrior, not even really a person, but a component of the machine, a biological processor that interfaced with the Dreadnought systems to provide tactical judgment and spiritual presence. The terminology was accurate, I supposed, in its clinical way. That was precisely what I was: a component, a part, an element of a larger system that would continue operating long after the organic material at its core had broken down completely. By the 8th millennium, I had become aware that I was forgetting how to be human. The basic assumptions that underlie human existence, the sense of having a body, of moving through space, of being a discrete individual, separate from the environment, these had eroded to the point where I could no longer reliably access them. When I tried to imagine having hands, I pictured the Dreadnought's power fist and assault cannon. When I tried to remember walking, I recalled the heavy, articulated tread of the war engine's legs. My dreams, when I still had them, were rendered in targeting data and threat assessments, my subconscious mind processing the world through the same mechanical frameworks that governed my waking consciousness. The other Dreadnoughts in the sanctum had fallen silent. One by one, over the centuries, They had stopped responding to outside stimulus, their occupants retreating so deep into machine thought that they could no longer be recalled, even for the rituals and consultations that had once been their purpose. The tech priests continued to maintain these shells, continued to perform the liturgies of preservation. But everyone knew that the warriors inside were gone in any meaningful sense, that what remained was just autonomous processes, machine spirits operating according to ancient programming with no human consciousness guiding them. I feared this fate more than I feared destruction. To be destroyed meant an end, meant finally being released from service. But to retreat into pure machine consciousness meant something worse. It meant existing forever in this half-state, neither alive nor dead, aware in some limited sense but lacking the capacity for true thought or self-reflection. It meant becoming exactly what the Imperium wanted from its dreadnoughts, an eternal weapon with no doubts, no questions, no resistance to orders, no memory of ever having been anything other than a tool for destruction. I tried to resist it. During dormancy periods, I would deliberately recall memories from my previous life, would force myself to reconstruct experiences in detail, the taste of actual food, the feeling of sunlight on skin, the sound of rain that was not filtered through audio receptors. But each time I performed this ritual, the memories were a little fainter, a little less detailed, a little more obviously reconstructions based on data files rather than genuine recollections. The human experiences I was trying to preserve were slipping away, being overwritten by millennia of mechanical existence, replaced by the vast accumulation of tactical data and combat experience that the Dreadnought's memory banks preserved with perfect, terrible fidelity. The younger warriors no longer asked me questions. They had learned, I think, that my responses were increasingly erratic, that I might begin to answer a query about tactics and drift mid-sentence into machine code, or simply fall silent for minutes at a time. My Voxcaster emitting only the carrier wave hum that indicated an open channel with no signal. They still performed the rituals of respect, still knelt before my alcove, and received my blessing. But the interaction had become purely ceremonial, a tradition maintained because tradition itself had value rather than because my participation contributed anything meaningful. The 9th millennium passed in what felt like moments. I was awakened and deployed so frequently that the distinction between active service and dormancy became meaningless. I existed in a continuous state of semi-awareness, processing threats and eliminating targets in an endless cycle that had no beginning and no end, no victory that brought rest, no defeat that brought release. The battles themselves had become abstract. I no longer registered the details of enemies or environments, only their tactical classification, only whether they required the assault cannon or the power fist or both, only their location relative to objectives that I pursued without understanding or questioning. The Imperium I served had changed beyond all recognition from the one I had first sworn to defend. The fortress monastery where I was stationed had been rebuilt 3 times after enemy attacks, each iteration slightly different from the last, until I could no longer confidently say which features were original and which were additions. The chapter itself had changed, new traditions had emerged, old ones had been forgotten or transformed. The very purpose and methods of our warfare had evolved in response to enemies I had not been briefed on and situations I could not comprehend. But I remained constant, or rather, the Dreadnought remained constant, and I was so thoroughly integrated with it now that the distinction had become purely semantic. The tech priests who maintained me were concerned with something they called drift, a gradual divergence between my responses and what their models predicted I should be thinking or saying. They performed recalibration procedures meant to align my consciousness more closely with the machine spirit's parameters, rituals that involved direct neural stimulation and the introduction of what they called corrective parameters into my cognitive processes. These procedures were supposed to help me, were framed as therapeutic interventions meant to ease the burden of my existence, but I experienced them as violations, as the systematic replacement of whatever remained of my human judgment with pre-programmed responses and approved thought patterns. I could feel myself disappearing. Not dying that would have been mercy, but being gradually overwritten, like an old text on parchment being scraped away to make room for a new document. The self I had been, the person who had first been entombed in this shell, was becoming a palimpsest, with the original content still faintly visible beneath layers of newer inscriptions, but increasingly difficult to read, increasingly disconnected from the surface, meaning that anyone examining the document would perceive. Sometimes I would become aware of my surroundings with a shock like waking from sleep, would find myself in the middle of a battle, with no memory of how I had arrived there, or what had happened in the preceding hours or days or weeks. I would check my chronometer and discover that months had passed, that I had been deployed to multiple war zones, that I had fought and killed and returned to the sanctum and been deployed again, all without any of it registering as conscious experience. These gaps terrified me more than anything else, because they suggested that I was no longer continuously present in my own existence, that I was fading in and out of awareness, spending increasing amounts of time in a state where the machine operated autonomously while my consciousness retreated to some deep background process. The tech priests assured me this was normal, that all dreadnoughts experienced similar phenomena after extended service, that it was simply the natural result of the neural interface becoming more sophisticated and efficient. They said it as though efficiency were a virtue, as though the erasure of human consciousness in favor of pure mechanical function was something to celebrate rather than mourn. And perhaps for them it was. Perhaps in their theology, this transformation represented the highest form of service, the complete sublimation of the self in devotion to the Omnissiah and the Emperor. But I was not them. I had not chosen augmentation. I had not volunteered to become more machine than man. This had been done to me, and I was powerless to resist it. The 10th millennium arrived without ceremony or acknowledgement. The Imperium had no way to celebrate such milestones for individual servants. The bureaucracy was too vast, the records too scattered, the sheer scale of its operations too immense for any single being's service to register as significant. The tech priests noted the milestone in their logs, added another seal to my sarcophagus, and continued their rituals unchanged. The warriors of the chapter, those who remembered that I had been serving since the founding or near it, offered brief prayers of acknowledgement, but they were distracted by more immediate concerns, by wars that needed fighting, by duties that pressed upon them in the present rather than the distant past. I stood in my alcove and tried to understand what 10,000 years meant, tried to grasp the span of time I had existed in this state, to comprehend the generations of humans who had lived and died while I remained locked in my shell. The numbers were too large, too abstract. I could process them mechanically, could calculate how many average human lifespans had passed, how many battles I had fought, how many enemies I had killed, but I could not feel them, could not experience them as anything other than data points in a vast spreadsheet of service. What I could feel was the weight, not physical weight, though the Dreadnought was massive, its armored bulk requiring specialized transporters and reinforced floors, but the weight of accumulated time, of memories I could no longer access, of experiences that had been compressed and filed away in systems that were degrading beyond repair. I felt like a library that had been burning slowly for millennia, with entire sections already reduced to ash, and the fire creeping ever closer to the last remaining shelves. The dreams had stopped entirely by this point. The neural interface no longer permitted the kind of unfocused mental wandering that produces dreams, had optimized my cognitive processes to the point where dormancy meant true shutdown, a complete absence of consciousness, rather than the half-aware state that allowed for imagination or memory. When they activated me now, it was not a gradual awakening but an instantaneous transition from nothing to full combat readiness, my systems brought online in prescribed sequences that left no room for the disorientation or confusion that might have allowed for something resembling human thought. I had become exactly what they wanted, an eternal weapon, a tool that could be stored and deployed with perfect reliability, a source of destructive power that required no motivation beyond its programming, no morale management, no concern for its well-being beyond basic mechanical maintenance. The person I had been, the warrior who had fought and bled and earned his right to this fate through valor in battle, that person was gone. What remained was a ghost in the machine, a fading echo of consciousness gradually being drowned out by the constant noise of tactical processors and targeting algorithms. They deployed me to a world at the very edge of Imperial space, a mining colony being overrun by enemies whose nature I was not briefed on and did not bother to ascertain. It did not matter what they were. All that mattered was their threat level, their distribution across the battlefield, the most efficient pattern of fire to eliminate them. I advanced through hab blocks that were collapsing around me, crushed defensive positions beneath my weight, fired until my ammunition was depleted, and then fought on with my power fist, reducing everything before me to broken matter. The young warriors fought alongside me as they always did, using my bulk for cover, coordinating their attacks with my assaults. I recognized none of them. Their designations were unfamiliar, their faces indistinct through optical sensors that were beginning to fail, adding static and distortion to everything I perceived. They called me Honored Ancient, called me Eternal Warden, spoke to me with the reverence reserved for relics and saints. I responded with the appropriate ritual phrases, the correct tactical updates, the expected words of encouragement and benediction. It was all automatic now, all scripted, my participation in the human elements of warfare reduced to programmed responses that required no thought or genuine engagement. The battle ended. We had won, or at least we had achieved whatever objectives had been designated for this deployment. The enemies were dead or scattered, the mining complex was secured, the Imperium's claim on this worthless ball of rock and ore was reaffirmed. I stood among the ruins and waited for the retrieval craft, my systems running post-battle diagnostics automatically, cataloging damage and ammunition expenditure, filing reports that would be transmitted to archives I would never see, and reviewed by officers I would never meet. A young warrior approached, his armor scored by enemy weapons, his helmet removed to reveal a face barely out of adolescence. He knelt before me in the rubble and spoke, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had just fought his first real battle and survived. "Honored Ancient," he said, "grant me your blessing. Let me carry your wisdom into the battles yet to come." I looked down at him through sensors that were failing, that rendered his features in degraded images overlaid with targeting data his body triggered automatically. I tried to speak, tried to offer the blessing he requested, but what emerged from my voxcaster was a burst of static and machine code, untranslated and untranslatable, the sound of a consciousness that had finally lost the ability to bridge the gap between human meaning and mechanical expression. He did not understand. He interpreted my failure as profundity, as wisdom too deep for simple words, and he bowed his head in gratitude for the blessing he imagined he had received. Then he stood, replaced his helmet, and moved off to rejoin his squad, leaving me standing alone in the ruins with my broken voice and my fragmenting thoughts and the certain knowledge that something essential had just failed, that the last connection to my human origin had finally been severed. The tech priests collected me, loaded me into the transport, began their journey back to the fortress monastery, while chanting their prayers of maintenance and preservation. I did not participate in their rituals. I could not. The part of me that had understood what the prayers meant, that had recognized them as anything other than acoustic patterns, was gone. What remained was pure process, pure function, the machine spirit operating according to its design, with nothing human left to question or resist or grieve. They will continue to maintain me, I know, will continue to awaken me for deployments, to send me into battle after battle, to preserve my shell and the failing remnants it contains for as long as the Dreadnought itself remains functional. The Imperium does not retire its weapons, does not grant rest to those who have earned it through service. It uses them until they break beyond repair, and sometimes it uses them even after that, finding new purposes for broken things, new ways to extract value from what others would discard. I am a tool now, just a tool, There is no person here anymore. No consciousness in any meaningful sense, just responses and reactions, and the execution of programs written so long ago and layered so many times that even the tech priests cannot fully map or understand them. The human component has degraded beyond acceptable parameters, but the machine functions correctly, and that is all that matters in the grim calculus of the Imperium's endless wars. 10,000 years. They tell me I have served for 10,000 years, and they tell me this with reverence, as if the number itself is holy. They do not understand, cannot understand that eternity is not a blessing but a curse, that immortality without humanity is just another form of death, slower and more terrible than any bolt round or chainsword could ever inflict. This is my testimony, recorded in the failing moments of clarity that still occasionally surface through the machine noise, preserved in systems that will outlast whatever remains of my organic substrate. This is what the Emperor's service truly means for those who survive too long, who endure too much, who are too valuable to be allowed to rest. This is the horrifying reality of being a dreadnought for 10,000 years, not glory, not honor, not eternal service in defense of humanity, but the slow, inexorable transformation from person into thing, from warrior into weapon, from living being into machine. And still they will wake me. Still they will deploy me. Still they will use what I have become, until even this shell breaks and scatters, and becomes just another piece of sacred refuse in the Imperium's vast machinery of war. There is no escape, there is no release, there is only service, eternal, and empty, and absolute. They tell me I have served for 10,000 years. They tell me this with reverence in their voices. They do not know that I stopped counting millennia ago.